We are in the middle of a very long series of messages called the Jesus Project. The Jesus Project, as you have heard, I think by this point, is our best attempt for us to cover everything Jesus said and did from the beginning to the end of all four of the Gospels, and to try to make sure that we understand him as best as we possibly can at this moment, at this stage of our lives, and at this stage of the game as we try to follow him from wherever we are. And we're all probably at different places when it comes to what it means for us to try to follow Jesus. But we've tried to kind of strip away some of those assumptions, strip away some of those things that maybe we have gained over time that were not necessarily great assumptions or ideas about Jesus, and maybe replace them with some better ways of thinking about him and what his mission was, what he was trying to accomplish while he was here on this planet for the few years that he was here. I have, most of you know at this point, I grew up in church, and so one of the things that I have been incredibly grateful for over the course of my life is that I've had some really tremendous mentors in faith over my years of trying to follow Jesus. My parents were my first mentors in faith. They got saved, started following Jesus somewhere around the time I was 2 or 3 years old. I don't really remember my parents in their pre-Jesus, life. Which from what they tell me is a good thing. It's probably a good thing. My parents were hippies. They were really like hippies. They were very much hippies. And they lived a life in the 60s and 70s that went along with being 60s and 70s hippies. And then they found Jesus, and they became sort of, if you were around at that time, some of you were, they became like these Jesus movement hippies. Because really what the Jesus movement was just like hippies who found Jesus, and they kept being hippies for the most part, and then they added in the Jesus piece, and the Jesus piece changed a lot of things about the way that they had lived their lives before, but then didn't change a lot of other things. A lot of peace and love and all that sort of stuff was, kind of floating around while they were, in that Jesus movement era of their lives. And so my parents, as good Jesus movement hippies, didn't go to an organized church because they didn't want to do that. They went to a home church first. And then they found that the home church got really weird. And then they went to a smaller church, and then they found that the small church got a little weird. And then they went to the church that I grew up in, this Assemblies of God church in Connecticut. And there, that was sort of where we settled in, our family settled in, kind of going and attending church. And so my parents talked a lot about their relationship with Jesus. It was a tangible part of our lives growing up. And then they introduced us to this other faith community, the church that I grew up in, and there I met a whole bunch of other people that introduced me to what it was to follow Jesus. And there were some good examples of it, and there were some not so good examples of it, and there were some ups and downs because it was a church full of people, just like every church is full of people. And there were some good moments, and there were some incredibly difficult moments, and all the stuff in between. And these men and women, over time, showed me what it meant to try to follow Jesus. And they did it as best as they possibly could with as much sincerity as they possibly could. And then I left home and I went to college, and I started to get introduced to other people and other churches and other faith communities, and I learned about other ways of following Jesus. I learned about some other people who thought about things a little different than the church that I had grown up in had always thought about things, and I started to engage with other pastors and church leaders, and I started to sort of, wrestle with these questions about my own faith and trying to figure out what it was like to, as an 18-year-old college kid living on his own for the first time, actually embrace a faith that was my own, that wasn't just what my parents had passed down to me, even though I respected and loved them, and it wasn't just what my church had given to me, but it started to sort of become my own. And then as I felt like I was called into pastoring and called to become a minister, I got introduced to a whole other set of mentors and pastors and church leaders and people that had a lot of influence and a lot of, ways of speaking into my life that have shaped who I am, even to this day, 25, 30 years later. For some of them, they're still speaking into my life, whether they know it or not. And then I met other mentors when I became a pastor. And most of the time when we think about mentors, we think about people who are older than us and people who are somewhere above us on the positional ladder. They're up on the hierarchy. It's a pastor who's ahead of you. It's a leader who's ahead of you. What I found when I came to New Life was there were a lot of mentors to my faith that I was supposed to be leading. and I didn't know what to do with that. There are people who, when I looked around on a Sunday morning, I thought, their faith in Jesus is way more sincere than my faith in Jesus. And I've got a microphone and I stand in front of people, but the way that they serve and the way that they love and the way that they care about people, they mentored me. Some of them were younger than me. Some of them were older than me. Some of them are still here. Some of them are not still here. But I've had this incredible privilege of having people mentor me in faith. And one of the things that I've found that I respect the most about people that have influenced and shaped my faith is they just wrestled with authentic spirituality and a genuine desire to follow Jesus. It wasn't about the show, and it wasn't about the production, and it wasn't about who saw and who knew, and it wasn't about whether or not they had all the answers. In fact, if I had asked them at the time, and I did ask some of them at the time, they didn't have all of the answers. They probably would tell you they still don't have all of the answers. And yet they had this sincere way of engaging with trying to follow Jesus that profoundly influenced me. And then there was another set of mentors that I've had in my life that I've never met. The only way I've met them is because I've read the things that they wrote. And because I've read the things that they've written, they have had a profound influence on my life and trying to figure out what it's like to follow Jesus in a world where you don't always have all of the answers. Because I don't know about your world, but I'll tell you about my world. In my world, I don't have all of the answers. Maybe that's good for some of you to hear. I don't have them all. You don't have them all. And if you came here today because you expected me to have them all and I was going to give them to you, you came to the wrong place. And if I came here expecting that you were going to have them all and you were going to give them to me, I came to the wrong place. But together we've come to this place because to some extent or another, we all recognize we have no answers. It's a whole lot of mystery. There's a whole lot that we don't know. There's a whole lot that we don't understand. And what we know and understand is really just a small sliver of what the truth is, I think. This is my supposition. One of the guys who's mentored me the most by writing and through the things that he's written is a guy named Frederick Buechner. He's a Presbyterian pastor, was a Presbyterian pastor, passed away a couple of years ago. Wrote sermons, wrote fiction, nonfiction stuff. And here's one of the things that he said, and we're going to talk about this together today in a sermon that he called Secrets in the Dark. He said it this way: faith is a way of waiting, never quite knowing, never quite hearing or seeing, because in the darkness we are all but a little lost. There is doubt hard on the heels of every belief, fear hard on the heels of every hope, and many holy things lie in ruins because the world has ruined them and we have ruined them. But faith waits even so, delivered at least from that final despair which gives up waiting altogether because it sees nothing worth waiting for. Faith waits for the opening of a door, the sound of footsteps in the hall, that beloved voice delayed so long that there are times when you all but give up hope of ever hearing it. And when at a moment you think you do hear it, if only faintly from far away, the question is, can it possibly be, impossibly be, that one voice of all voices? Now, I don't know about you, and I don't know how much life experience you've had. We're old and young today. We've got a pretty broad spectrum across the board. But I think that all of us have at one point or another found that we believe something and we hope for something, and then there's another part of us that can't quite believe and can't quite hope. And there's a piece of us that believes, and then there's a piece of us that doesn't believe. And there's a piece of us that wants to have confidence, that wants to be bold, that wants to say, absolutely, I'm 100,000% certain. And then there's another piece of you, if you were real honest, and some of us are less than honest, but if you were real honest, there's another piece of you that's like struggling with it, that's in that waiting period where like, I know that there's a voice that I'm waiting to hear. I know that there's a door that I'm waiting for it to open, but it's not open yet. And there's a part of you that wonders if it ever will. This morning, we're going to talk about what it's like to live inside of that place. Because in Mark's gospel, when he tells the story, and we've talked about it over the last couple of weeks. Pastor Andrew talked a couple of weeks ago about Peter's confession. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. It's this high moment in the Gospels. And then it's followed right on the heels of that confession is the story that we talked about last week, the story of Jesus' transfiguration. His face, he takes Peter, James, and John up on the mountain. His face becomes brilliantly white, brighter than anything they've ever seen on this planet before. Peter says, we got to do something about this. We got to build a structure. We got to contain this. And they hear the voice speak from heaven that says, this is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Everything that he says, pay attention to. And then they go down from the mountain. Because at some point or another, all of us in every experience that we've had, every high moment of faith, every moment where we're like, I know for sure, I've seen it with my own eyes. I've experienced it with my own life. And then we walk down whatever mountain we were on, and we are confronted almost immediately. Isn't it weird how this happens? Almost immediately with something that makes you say, wait, what did I just see? What did I just experience? What did I just hear? When Jesus first heard the voice speak from heaven at his baptism, if you remember this part of the story, he heard the voice that said, you are my beloved Son. And then immediately after his baptism, remember what happened? He went out into the wilderness and he experiences the temptation. He face-to-face kind of deals with Satan, offering him all of these other opportunities. Now coming down from another mountain, hearing a voice from heaven, this is my beloved Son, he walks into another mess. And here's how Mark tells the story. When they came to the disciples down from the mountain, having experienced this tremendous transfiguration moment, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. Nothing like jumping right back into it, right? Like, here we go again. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, when they saw Jesus, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, what are you arguing about? And someone from the crowd answered him, Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able. And Jesus answered them, O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me. Nothing like mountaintop experience right into the valley again. Mountaintop transfiguration, revelation of Jesus, bright white shining face, the Son of God, heaven breaking into earth, and then going into confrontation with this power that's still at work inside of this earth, because it's just as much as at work in Jesus' world as it is in ours. Jesus comes to this moment where his disciples are arguing with the scribes, and Mark doesn't really tell us what they were arguing about, but what it seems like they might have been arguing about was whether or not Jesus and his disciples had the authority to do the kinds of things that they were doing, going around and casting out demons. In other words, what these scribes are probably thinking is that the man who brings his son to Jesus' disciples shouldn't be bringing him to Jesus' disciples. They should be bringing him to someone who is like authorized to do this. Jesus and his disciples are not authorized. They haven't gone through the right channels. They're not the right kind of people. They're sort of this rogue outfit over here casting out demons, and Jesus is healing the sick and all of that sort of stuff. But they don't really love the fact that Jesus is out here kind of doing things on his own authority. And it seems to me most likely that they were arguing back and forth about whether or not the disciples had the authority to be casting out demons in the first place. But regardless of that, whether they have the authority or not, what Mark makes clear is they couldn't do it. They were not believing enough. They were not faith-filled enough. They didn't have enough courage. They didn't have enough whatever it was inside of that moment. And so this man brings his son to Jesus' disciples, hoping that they will take care of the issue that's going on inside of him, and they are powerless in front of this demon. Now, the other thing that we should talk about, right, is that when you read that description, there's a part of you that says, oh, that guy was having an epileptic seizure, right? Has everybody heard that before or seen that? Or when you see that, you're like, oh, yeah, that's probably, that makes sense. In fact, it makes so much sense that some current English translations of Matthew's story, version of this story, will actually say that the guy was having an epileptic fit. Now, here's what we should do. We should suspend our modern superiority complex for just a moment. And we should understand that if Mark wanted to say the man was having an epileptic fit, he could have said that. There were Greek words that were available to him to say this is what was happening. And some of us, and again, sometimes it's well-intentioned, sometimes it's less than well-intentioned, we always like to find a really naturalistic explanation for what's going on inside of the scriptures. And Mark had all of those tools available to him. We should not imagine, we get this modern superiority complex. We're so much smarter than people were 2,000 years ago. We've got so much more medicine and wisdom and science and technology and understanding. And yet, for all of our wisdom, technology, science, and understanding, there are things that we are woefully ignorant about. And Mark says the guy was possessed by a demon. And again, if he wanted to say it was an epileptic fit, he could have, but he didn't. He said this man was possessed by something outside of this world that was in opposition to everything good that Jesus was trying to do. And this father brings his son to Jesus and Jesus' disciples, hoping that the disciples would actually be able to provide him with some kind of relief. Because from the time this boy has been young, something has been going on inside of him that manifests itself on the outside and makes his life incredibly difficult and incredibly painful. And Mark doesn't tell us exactly how long this has been going on, but we get the sense that this has gone on for quite a while. And so they brought the boy to Jesus. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy. He fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And the father said, "From childhood, and it has often cast him into fire and into water in an attempt to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And what happens is when Jesus brings the boy to himself and they place him in front of Jesus, the boy has what looks like a seizure, what looks like this moment, but also looks like a demon manifesting itself in the presence of the Son of God, who has all authority and all power. And Jesus has a conversation with the dad, and it's not a very long conversation, but it's essentially this: how long have we been experiencing this? How long has this gone on? And I don't know if you hear it the way that I hear it, but again, if you were to put yourself in that dad's situation, bringing his child to Jesus and Jesus' disciples, seeking some relief, seeking some healing from a thing that has attempted over time to destroy your child, there's a little bit of desperation inside this guy at this point. There's a little bit of probably frustration inside of this guy. I brought my child to your disciples, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't fix it. They couldn't deal with the problem. They couldn't give me any relief. They couldn't give my son any relief. And again, those of you who have kids, you understand this, right? That when your child suffers, it's different than when you suffer. And when you watch your child suffer, there's that thing inside of you that says, I would gladly trade places with my child. I'll take that so that he doesn't have to suffer, so that she doesn't have to suffer, so that they don't have to deal with what they're dealing with. I would take it on myself. There's that sort of desperation. And again, I feel like when this dad comes to Jesus, he comes to Jesus with all of these years of experience that are saying nothing helps. Nothing. And so when he speaks to Jesus, he says it this way, and I love the way that it's recorded. If you can do anything, have compassion on us. Help us. And I don't know if you've ever been to that spot, but I've been to that spot. And this dad is in that spot. And here's the place where he finds himself. In absolute uncertainty. In absolute desperation for the life of his child. And when he prays, because this is what he does, when he prays to Jesus, he prays, if you can do something about this, would you please help us? Now, if you grew up in certain kind of faith backgrounds and certain kind of traditions, you were told that that is absolutely the wrong way for you to pray. When you pray with confidence, and you pray with certainty, and you put a thee and a thou in there, and thus saith the Lord, and you pray that way, and if you want something to happen, that's the way for you to pray. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, as my parents used to say. This is what you say. Jesus, help me. Jesus, heal my son. Jesus, you are the Son of God, the Son of the living God. Put all the things in a row, line up all the right words and phrases, just say it perfectly. He doesn't have any of that. He's in a completely desperate place. And he says, Jesus, if you can, would you please help me? How do you pray when you feel uncertain? How do you pray when you're not sure of what the answer will be? Because I think we all find ourselves there at some moment or another. Maybe you find yourself sitting in a moment like that now, where you are not sure what the outcome will be, when you don't know. And not only, and sometimes I think in church circles and in Christian circles, we give ourselves permission to say, well, I don't know if Jesus will do it. I don't know if Jesus or if God will heal me or heal my family member or my child or my parent or my friend or my spouse. I don't know if Jesus will do what I'm asking him to do, but I know that he could do what I'm asking him to do. But this man doesn't even have that. He doesn't even have, I know you could, but I don't know if you will. He says, I don't even know if you can. Have you ever felt so uncertain about your faith that you don't even know if God can do anything about it? Have you ever faced something that felt so monumental, that felt so desperate, that felt so beyond you, that felt so absolutely impossible that you weren't even sure if God could do something about it? When we find ourselves in uncertainty, there is this human piece of us that just wants to pretend. Just pretend. The disciples could have come to the guy and said, hey, here's how this works, just so you know. If you're going to ask Jesus for something, you got to do it with some confidence. Like the woman who said, even the crumbs that fall from the table are good enough for me. Even if it's just a little bit of your grace, even if it's just a little, have that kind of faith, have that kind of confidence and that kind of certainty. But they don't have time for that. He just says, here's how I feel. I don't even know if you can. I don't even know if you could resolve this. But if you can, would you do something to show compassion? And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. And immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. Jesus said, I absolutely can. If you can is not really part of the situation here. I can. All things, he says, are possible for the one who believes. And what he's doing with this guy, and I love it. It's one of my favorite stories. I love it because he's not rebuking the man at all. He's not saying, I can't believe that you don't believe. I can't believe that you don't think I can. I can't believe that you don't have enough courage and enough faith and enough conviction in me. I'm the Son of God. We were just up on the mountain. My face was shining with the light of heaven into earth. How dare you not believe? So all things are possible for the one who believes. And this is interesting, right? All things are possible, and not all things are guaranteed. But the only way to find out if the thing that you wonder is possible, if it's possible or not, the only way to find out if it's possible is for you to believe that it might be. That's the only way. The only way for you to find out whether or not God can or whether or not God will do the thing that you are asking him to do, whether or not God is on the other side of the door that you are knocking on, whether or not there is some voice from somewhere in the universe that's calling out to you that has some sort of plan, has some sort of direction for this life that you find yourself in the middle of. The only way for you to find out if it's there or not is for you to believe it. And even as much as you believe it, not everything's guaranteed, right? Because you can tell stories and I can tell stories of times that we believed that something could happen and it didn't happen. And that's one sort of story. But then there are other sorts of stories when you weren't sure if you could believe that something could happen and it did happen. And those things that you thought were not possible actually were possible. It's this weird tension that we live in inside of this story. And it's this weird tension that we live in inside of our human story. All things are possible. Not all things are guaranteed. Jesus says this is the way it works. And as he says that, I think he extends an invitation to the man. And the man takes it in the best possible way. And what he says to Jesus is, for me, the most profound confession of faith that we find in the Gospels. Right? I love Peter. You are the Christ. You're the Son of the living God. I love Peter and James and John up on the mountain seeing Jesus' face shining bright white with the light of heaven. But I love this guy's confession more. Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. And I think he walks this fine little line of our human experience, because what he says is, I have some faith, but there's a huge part of me sometimes, it feels like, that doesn't. There's a part of me that is unbelieving. There's a part of me that believes, and I believe that you can do this, and I believe that maybe you will do this. But there's also this part of me that doesn't believe, that feels like maybe you can't, and maybe you won't, even if you could. And I think that genuine faith requires courage and honesty. It requires courage on one hand to say, Lord, I believe. Doesn't it? In the face of something that is seemingly impossible. For this man, if you put yourself in his shoes, or you think about shoes that you've been in at certain points in your life, or that you are in this moment, it requires great courage to say, Lord, I believe. It also requires great honesty to say, help my unbelief. And without the two of those things joining together, I think we are missing out on this key piece of what it means for us to follow Jesus and try to engage with him. It requires the courage on the one hand to say, I believe. It requires the honesty on the other hand to say, help my unbelief. And there are some people who would love to just stop the man's confession on the very first three words. Lord, I believe, period. Some people will tell you that that's exactly what your faith requires. For you to follow Jesus, it requires, Lord, I believe, period. And I would tell you that I don't think they're right. Some people would tell you, I don't want to say the rest of the line. Help my unbelief. Some people would tell you, I'm very content just not believing. I'm just very content not asking for help in the areas where I don't believe, I don't have faith, I don't have conviction. Jesus says, let's bring these two things together. Lord, I believe. Let's have courage, and let's also have the honesty to say, I don't always believe, but I would like some help with the areas that I don't believe. And if you can bring those two things together, I think you can actually genuinely and sincerely try to follow Jesus. If you put a period at the end, Lord, I believe, this is just my thought, and you take it for whatever it's worth. I think there will come a point in your life and in your story where that's just not enough. And you will beat yourself up because you don't have enough faith. And you'll beat yourself up, or you'll let somebody else beat you down because they'll tell you, you don't believe enough. And it's possible that if you put an end at the end of those three words, your faith cracks underneath the pressure of this life. So put a comma there. Or a semicolon, I don't remember which one it is. I'm bad with grammar. It's not my strong suit. Lord, I believe. And when you find that thing, that moment, that space in your life that tests your faith, that tests your belief, that tests your confidence and your conviction in all of the things that you believe are true, give yourself the opportunity to then say, help my unbelief. I believe. But this feels really big. And I don't know if you can, I don't know if you will. So in that unbelieving place that I find myself in at times, would you help me? Don't let me sit there. Don't let me stay there. Don't let me stay in a place where I'm always doubting and I'm never believing. Let me move to a place where I believe a little bit better. And I think that that's what it's like for us to try to follow Jesus. It's to live in a place where genuine faith requires our courage and our honesty. Here's how the story ends. It's a Lord, if you can, and he does story. And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered into the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. We can't cover that part. We just put it on there because I told you we were going to read everything from beginning to end, but we don't have time to cover that part. We'll deal with it another day. Because I think, at least for me, this is the story. Jesus meets unbelieving believers. This is what he always does. Jesus meets people with the courage and the honesty to say, Lord, I believe. Help me in my unbelief. If you find yourself in that place, if you're willing to make that kind of confession, as uncertain and as tentative as it feels at times, I think that's exactly the kind of thing that Jesus loves to hear from us. Because it's not pretend. It's not, Lord, I believe, period, and masks over the part of you that is wondering. It's, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. When we find that we have the courage and the honesty to make that confession in the face of whatever difficulty you experience in this life and in this world, I think that that's the place where Jesus meets us. Would you pray with us this morning? Jesus, we are grateful that you meet us again, as uncertain as we are at times, as unconvinced as we can be at times, as doubting as we can even be at times, as filled with unbelief as we can be. And rather than condemning us for our lack of faith, you just present yourself to us again and you invite that confession. Lord, I believe. Help me in my unbelief. And so, Jesus, we are here today because we are, all of us, to one extent or another, unbelieving believers. People who have faith and have the courage to say, Lord, I believe. And if we're honest, there are those moments where we just don't, and we're not sure. Where we come down off the mountain and we're confronted with the realities of our day-to-day life that don't always conform to what we believe. So Jesus, I pray, fill us with courage and with the honesty that we need to see you as you are and to invite you into our lives in this moment and in this space. And I pray that in that place that you meet us, pray that as you are present with us there, we would learn to trust you just a little bit more. It's in your name we pray. Amen.